The divorce papers were on the kitchen table, not hidden, not tucked into an envelope, not slipped beneath a magazine the way someone might hide a bill they were ashamed of. They were laid out flat, squared neatly at the corners the way Karen always arranged things, centered, deliberate, impossible to miss. A glass of water sat beside them, as if she'd anticipated I might need something to swallow. I remember standing in the doorway with a gas station bouquet in my hand, yellow tulips wrapped in cellophane, the kind that wilt if you look at them wrong. I'd bought them on impulse at the exit ramp off I-71, 20 minutes outside Columbus, because I'd been gone for 4 days on a project in Cincinnati, and I wanted the drive home to mean something. I wanted to walk through the door and have it feel like arrival rather than return. Instead, I stood there reading the header on the top document. In the matter of the marriage of Karen Lynn Mercer and Thomas Allen Mercer. The county seal. A case number. A date already filed. 3 days ago, while I was still in Cincinnati pricing load-bearing walls for a warehouse conversion and texting Karen photos of the hotel breakfast because Owen had asked me once what hotels served and I'd promised to show him. My name is Thomas. I'm 41 years old. I'm a structural engineer, the kind nobody photographs for magazines, but who keeps bridges from falling. I've been married to Karen for 9 years. We have 2 children. Owen, who is 6, obsessed with dinosaurs and the precise weight of things, and Sophie, who is 9, and who reads at a level that makes her teachers slightly uncomfortable. We bought this house, a 4-bedroom colonial in Westerville with a yard Owen calls the dinosaur territory, 6 years ago. I painted Sophie's room myself, twice, because the first shade of purple she picked turned out to be too much purple, and she cried quietly about it at bedtime and thought I didn't notice. I noticed everything. That was always my problem, or so Karen would eventually tell the court. I set the tulips on the counter beside the sink. I didn't throw them away. I didn't know what else to do with them. Karen came downstairs 20 minutes later in the measured way she had of descending, one hand on the rail, each step placed with precision, as though she were always slightly aware of being observed. She was wearing the gray cardigan she'd owned since before we met, and her hair was pulled back in the simple knot she used when she didn't want to talk about anything. I had learned to read her in the language of cardigan and knot and posture, 9 years of fluency in the small grammar of her body, and what I read now was, "This is already decided." "You saw them," she said. It wasn't a question. I saw them. She moved to the refrigerator and poured herself a glass of filtered water. She offered me nothing. That small absence told me more than the papers had. "I want to do this calmly," she said. "I want to be reasonable." "Okay," I said, though my voice sounded borrowed from someone else, flat and careful and not quite mine. "The children are at my mother's tonight. I thought it would be better." "Better." I turned the word over. Better for whom? Better by what measure? Better in the sense of kinder, or better in the sense of strategically cleaner? "When did you decide this?" I asked. She looked at me across the kitchen, our kitchen, with the subway tile backsplash I'd installed on a long weekend in March and the drawer that still stuck slightly because I'd never gotten around to planing the wood, and she said, "A long time ago, Thomas. I've been deciding for a long time." That night, I slept in the guest room that had slowly accumulated the overflow of our lives. Owen's art supplies, an elliptical machine neither of us used, 3 boxes of books I kept meaning to shelve. I lay on the narrow pull-out with my eyes open, listening to the house breathe around me, and I thought, she told the children before she told me. Sophie and Owen were at their grandmother's, insulated and prepared, while I was standing in the doorway with gas station tulips. It was the planning that undid me, not the ending. Marriages end. I understood that marriages could end, but the architecture of it, the careful, quiet construction of an exit while I was standing inside the same walls. The next morning, Karen told me she would be requesting primary physical custody. I did not sleep again for 3 days. Thomas's arrival home with flowers is not mere sentiment. It is the physical embodiment of the expectation he has carried through 9 years of marriage. That return means welcome, that effort means reciprocity, that the rituals of a shared life carry mutual weight. The tulips are almost painfully symbolic, bought on impulse, perishable, and ultimately placed beside a sink rather than in a vase, because the gesture had nowhere to land. What the opening section reveals psychologically is the gap between Thomas's perception of the marriage and Karen's lived experience of it. He has been reading her body language for 9 years and believes himself fluent. Yet the most significant communication she has sent, the papers, the timing, the strategic removal of the children, arrived without warning. This is the fundamental wound beneath the legal one. Not that the marriage is ending, but that he did not know it was already over. Karen's behavior shows the hallmarks of someone who has emotionally detached over a long period and is now operating from a place of resolved clarity rather than conflict. Her calmness is not cruelty. It is the composure of someone who has already grieved, already decided, already prepared. She is not at the beginning of this process. Thomas is. That asymmetry, one partner in shock, the other in execution, defines the power imbalance at the heart of what follows. The detail of Sophie's purple room, painted twice, signals what Thomas cannot yet articulate, that he has always paid attention, always adjusted, always tried. His tragedy is not neglect but invisibility, the possibility that his form of love, expressed in labor and presence and careful observation, was simply not the form Karen needed, and that neither of them ever found the language to say so. I should explain what our life looked like before the papers, because it is easy, I have learned this, to revise the past once the present becomes ugly. People look backward through the lens of what they now know and rearrange events to fit the conclusion, the way you might rearrange furniture after a guest has pointed out it doesn't work. I don't want to do that. I want to tell it as it was. We were not a miserable couple. That is the thing that people, friends, colleagues, eventually a family court judge, seemed unable to fully believe. Miserable couples are easier to understand. Their endings have a kind of narrative sense. We were something harder to explain. We were a couple who had grown apart along a gradient so gradual that neither of us could point to the moment it began. Karen taught 4th grade at an elementary school 8 minutes from our house. She had taught for 11 years and was genuinely gifted at it, the kind of teacher children remember at 40, whose name comes up at reunions. She was organized, warm in a measured way, deeply competent. She baked on Sunday mornings, not from joy, I think, but from the satisfaction of precision, the reliable alchemy of measured ingredients producing a known result. The children loved her baking. I loved her baking. It is hard to build a case against someone who makes excellent banana bread on Sunday mornings and reads to your daughter before bed and never once, in 9 years, forgot a pediatric appointment. And yet, there were signals I registered without knowing what I was registering. The way conversations in the evening had shortened, not to silence, but to the functional minimum. Owen needs new sneakers. Sophie has a project due Thursday. Can you take the car in? Administrative language, the dialect of logistics. I told myself this was what happened to couples with 2 children and 2 careers, that the substance of marriage migrated, over time, into the management of shared life, and that this was not failure but maturity. I told myself this sincerely. I believed it. Karen had a best friend named Diane who had been her college roommate and who lived 40 minutes away in Dublin. They met for dinner most Thursday evenings, which I had never found remarkable. Diane was loud and funny and had been divorced twice, which Karen said was because Diane didn't know how to stop choosing the same man in different packaging. I liked Diane. She always asked me about my work with the specific interest of someone who is curious about things she doesn't understand, which is a form of intelligence I admire. What I didn't know, what I would not know for months, was that Thursday dinners with Diane had, at some point, evolved into something more complicated. Not in the way I would eventually fear, but in a way that was, in its own fashion, just as consequential. The first signal I can trace with any certainty came on a Tuesday in October. Owen had been home from school with a low fever. Nothing serious, the kind of low-grade warmth that makes a 6-year-old theatrical and clingy. I'd rearranged my morning to work from home, parked at the kitchen table with my laptop, while Owen built a sprawling dinosaur habitat on the living room floor using couch cushions and kitchen towels. Karen had gone to work because she had a substitute already scheduled for another date and didn't want to move things twice. At around 11, Owen fell asleep on the couch mid-sentence, the way young children sometimes do, one moment narrating a Triceratops rescue mission, the next simply absent, folded into the cushions with his mouth slightly open. I covered him with a blanket and went back to my laptop. Karen's phone was on the kitchen counter, charging. She'd forgotten it, which was unusual for her. She used it for attendance, for parent communication, for everything. I picked it up to put it somewhere less likely to get knocked over and the screen lit with a message preview. I wasn't trying to read it. I read it. Just saw him. He asked about you. Same as always. I told him you're doing what you need to do. Call me when tea is gone. The sender's name said Diane. I set the phone face down on the counter. I stood very still for a moment, the way you do when you've touched something hot and the pain hasn't fully arrived yet. Then I went back to my laptop. T, one letter. Clean and simple, and carrying the weight of someone who had a shorthand for my name that implied a whole private language I wasn't part of. I told myself there were explanations. An old friend of Diane's, some drama I wasn't aware of, some matter entirely unrelated to me. I was, by nature, an engineer. I believed in structural analysis before conclusions, in testing load before assuming failure. I made myself apply that discipline to the message on Karen's phone. I was almost successful. That evening Karen came home, and I said nothing. She made pasta. The specific pasta she made when she was tired. The one with canned tomatoes and basil from the pot on the windowsill that she maintained with the kind of attentiveness she gave to things that couldn't disappoint her. She asked about Owen's fever. She helped Sophie with a reading response. She folded a load of laundry while listening to a podcast she'd recommended to me once that I'd never gotten around to. I watched her and understood that I was watching her differently now. Not with suspicion, exactly. With attention. As if I were surveying a structure I'd thought I knew and had started to wonder whether my original calculations were sound. Thomas's refusal to immediately interpret the text message as threatening is not denial in the clinical sense. It is the rational discipline of a man whose professional instinct is to withhold judgment until evidence is conclusive. This same quality that makes him an excellent engineer makes him a poor detective of his own life. He has built a habit of trusting process over instinct, and that habit now works against him. What is psychologically significant here is not the message itself, but the name, T. Abbreviations in intimate communication signal familiarity and exclusion simultaneously. They create an inside space that implicitly has an outside. For Thomas, who has spent years believing he was fully inside Karen's life, the single letter performs the same function as the gray cardigan and the pulled-back knot. It is a signal in a language he did not know existed. Karen's behavior in this section, the competent, consistent, warm routine of pasta and laundry and children's homework, is not a mask or performance. It is who she is. This is what makes the emerging conflict so psychologically complex. There is no villain. Karen is not pretending to care about her family. She genuinely does. But she is, simultaneously, living in a parallel interior world she has not shared with Thomas. The human capacity to compartmentalize, to love one's children absolutely, while constructing an exit from the marriage, is uncomfortable to acknowledge because it resists simple moral categories. The most important detail in this section is Owen asleep on the couch. Thomas covers him with a blanket, goes back to his work, and then sees the message. The domestic tenderness and the unsettling discovery occupy the same moment, the same kitchen. This compression, intimacy and threat in the same frame, is precisely what makes the experience of suspected betrayal so disorienting. It is not that the world has changed, it is that the world has split. The second signal came from Sophie. My daughter had inherited Karen's precision and my tendency to observe quietly before speaking, which produced in her a combination that sometimes alarmed her teachers. A child who watched everything and said exactly what she meant when she chose to say anything at all. She was not a chatty child. She was a recording child. It was a Saturday in November. I had taken the kids to the Natural History Museum. Owen for the dinosaurs, Sophie for the gem and mineral collection she'd been cataloging in a notebook since she was 7. We were in the cafe eating mediocre grilled cheese when Sophie looked up from her notebook and said, without preamble, "Dad, do you know Uncle Brett?" I processed the name. "I don't think so, Bug." "Who's Uncle Brett?" She returned to her notebook. "He came to our house." I put down my sandwich. "When was this?" "When you were in Cincinnati," she said, in the tone she used for things she considered already established. "Mom had people over. He brought wine. Owen called him Uncle Brett because Diane told him to." I asked, as evenly as I could manage, "What did he look like?" She described him with the specificity she brought to everything. Tall, brown hair going gray at the sides, wore a vest like a hiking vest, but it was clean, smelled like cedar. She paused and added, "He knew my name already." He knew my name already. I folded my paper napkin into quarters, then into eighths. What did he and Mom talk about? I don't know. They went on the porch. She looked up at me with the clear, measuring gaze that had been unnerving since she was 3. Are you upset? No, I said. I'm just curious. She held the look for a moment longer than was comfortable, then looked back down at her notebook. Sophie had a child's radar for adult dishonesty, and I was performing honesty poorly. She let it go, which was its own form of kindness. In the car on the way home, Owen announced that Uncle Brett had taught him how to whistle and demonstrated at length. The whistle was imperfect, but clearly practiced. That night, after the children were asleep, I sat at my desk in the study and opened my laptop. I told myself I was going to do nothing. I typed Brett into Google and stared at the empty search bar for a long time. Then I closed the laptop and went to bed. I did not sleep. The following week, I asked Karen, casually, over coffee on a Wednesday morning before anyone else was up, whether Diane had been over recently. She stopped by Saturday, Karen said, looking at her phone. Just for a bit. Not a party. Not people. Diane. Just for a bit. I held the discrepancy gently, the way you hold a cracked thing you don't want to break further. Did she bring anyone? Karen looked up from her phone with an expression I had seen before, but never correctly identified. A brief internal recalibration, quick as a blink. Her friend Brett, I think. I barely saw them. I was putting Owen to bed. Barely saw them. Sophie had placed her mother and Brett on the porch together. One of these accounts was wrong, and I was nearly certain it wasn't Sophie's. What does he do? I asked. Brett. He's in finance. I don't really know him. She returned to her phone. Why? Owen mentioned him, I said. The small silence that followed was shaped differently than her other silences. It had weight and direction, like a load-bearing member under stress. Then she said, kids remember people who pay attention to them. And the conversation moved on, and I let it, because I didn't yet know what I was building toward, and a premature confrontation felt structurally unsound. I began to notice other things. A particular focus on her appearance on Thursday evenings. Not dramatic, not outside the range of a normal woman going out to dinner, but consistent in a way I had previously categorized as simply Karen taking care of herself. I recategorized it now. I noticed that she'd downloaded Signal on her phone in September, an encrypted messaging app, and filed it at the time under a vague mental note that meant nothing. I relocated that note now. Most significantly, I noticed that Karen had started sleeping with her phone face down on the nightstand. For 9 years, it had sat face up, screen open to the ceiling, the way most people left phones in spaces where they felt safe. A small thing, an entirely explicable thing. And yet the structural engineer in me understood that small changes in load distribution were never actually small. In the first week of December, Diane called me. I almost didn't answer. Diane generally communicated with me through Karen, as peripheral friends tend to do. But I answered, and she said, Thomas, I wanted to talk to you. Her voice had none of its usual velocity. She sounded like someone who had rehearsed an opening line and abandoned it. Okay, I said. A pause. She's not a bad person. I felt the cold move through me the way cold moves through a building when a window breaks in winter. Instant and total. I know she's not, I said carefully. She's been unhappy for a long time. And I think she's made some choices I don't entirely agree with. Another pause. I thought someone should tell you to pay attention. To what, Diane? But she'd already arrived at the limit of what she'd allowed herself. I shouldn't have called, she said, and hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. Diane knew something. Diane disapproved of something. And Diane had, in the language of that text message I'd seen in October, been managing the logistics of whatever it was. The same as always. I told him you're doing what you need to do. Now she was calling me at 7 in the evening while Karen was giving Owen a bath, with a voice full of guilt and the unfinished architecture of a warning. I thought about calling her back. I thought about going upstairs and simply asking Karen directly. I thought about 100 things I might do, and did none of them, because I was still, at that point, afraid of the answer. Diane's phone call is the pivot point of part 3, and it functions as both a revelation and a moral complication. By warning Thomas, however obliquely, Diane breaks the implicit alliance she has maintained with Karen and creates a chain reaction that Thomas cannot stop even if he wanted to. The cause is Diane's guilt. The effect is Thomas's activation. Once warned, he cannot return to the comfortable ambiguity he has been maintaining. Sophie's account of Uncle Brett is perhaps the most devastating moment in this section because it arrives through the most innocent possible channel. Children report what they observe without the social filtering that adults apply, and Sophie's matter-of-fact description, the vest, the cedar smell, the detail that Brett already knew her name, carries the precision of a witness who has no investment in the meaning of what she's describing. She is simply reporting. The horror is entirely in the reception. The detail that Brett already knew, Sophie's name, is the signal Thomas cannot rationalize away. It implies that Karen has spoken of her children to this man in a context private enough that he has not been introduced to them directly, which in turn implies a relationship with a history, with conversations, with an interior life Karen has not shared with her husband. This is the moment Thomas's suspicion crosses from possible to probable, not because of any single dramatic revelation, but because the weight of accumulated small details has exceeded the threshold his discipline can hold. Karen's lie about Saturday, barely saw them, I was putting Owen to bed, is also significant. She does not deny Brett entirely, which would be a larger lie and therefore a larger risk. She minimizes and contextualizes, which is the strategy of someone experienced in managing information rather than eliminating it. Thomas recognizes the structure of the lie even without being able to prove it. And this recognition, this awareness that he is being managed, is what ultimately converts grief into determination. I want to be precise about this section because it is the one I am least comfortable with and the one that matters most to what came later. I am not, by nature or inclination, a surveillance person. The idea of tracking another adult, recording, monitoring, analyzing, sits badly with me in a way that I found impossible to fully override, even when I had reasons. I tell you this not because I want absolution, but because the moral discomfort I felt throughout the following weeks was real, and it shaped how I went about things, and ultimately it mattered. What I did first was legal and, I think, defensible. I spoke with a family law attorney named Patricia Reeves, recommended by a colleague who'd gone through a quiet divorce 3 years earlier. I made the appointment under a flimsy professional pretext and then sat in her office, in a low chair across from a woman who had been watching people unravel in this room for 20 years and explained what I suspected. She asked me several questions, calmly, with the focused patience of someone who has heard worse and knows the procedural value of worse. When I finished, she said, "The first thing you need to understand is that marital fault is largely irrelevant to asset division in Ohio. What is relevant, to custody, is the quality of each parent's relationship with the children." "She's a good mother," I said immediately. "I meant it." "I believe you," Patricia said. "And you'll need to demonstrate that you're a good father. Not just state it. Demonstrate it, in a way that produces documentation." She paused. "Do you have evidence of your involvement with the children's daily lives?" I thought about it. I had 9 years of involvement. I had driven Sophie to school approximately 400 times. I had attended every pediatric appointment I was physically able to attend, documented on calendars I kept for work planning. I had coached Owen's Saturday soccer for 1 season before he decided he preferred dinosaurs to sports. I had been present, consistently, in the accumulating ordinary ways that fathers are present when they are trying. None of it was documented. "Start documenting," Patricia said. "Everything. School pickups, doctor visits, homework sessions, your children's routines, their needs, their preferences. The court will want to see who is the de facto primary parent. And I'll warn you that in many cases, that perception defaults toward mothers regardless of the actual division of labor." I left her office with a legal pad of notes and a feeling like structural failure beginning at the foundation. What I did second was less defensible, and I have thought about it more than anything else since. I hired a private investigator. His name was Gary Fenwick, and he'd been recommended, obliquely, through a chain of suggestion I won't detail, as someone who was precise and discreet and who stayed on the legal side of legal. He was in his late 50s, compact and unremarkable in the specific way that made him good at his job. He wore a brown jacket. He had the comfortable manner of a man who had stopped being surprised by people decades ago. I told him what I knew. He listened without expression. When I finished, he said, "You want to know if there's a relationship? I want to know what I'm dealing with before she uses it against me." I said. "She may not use it," Gary said. "She's already filed," I said. "She's already requesting primary custody. I need to know the context." He looked at me for a moment. Knowing won't necessarily help you. Courts don't like it when fathers investigate mothers. It looks aggressive, regardless of what's found. I understand the risk. He nodded, slowly, and opened a notebook. What Gary found, over the following 3 weeks, was not what I expected. Or rather, what he found was simultaneously more and less damaging than I'd feared. Brett Calloway was 44 years old, divorced, a senior portfolio manager at a regional investment firm. He had 2 children of his own, joint custody, no criminal record. He and Karen had been introduced through Diane 2 years ago at a mutual friend's dinner party. They had, according to Gary's sources, phone records obtained legally through a process he described without elaborating, been in communication for approximately 18 months. 18 months. I did the math automatically. 18 months ago, Owen had turned 5, and we had thrown him a small party at the nature center. I had baked a dinosaur cake from a template I found online, and it was badly proportioned, and Owen had loved it with an unreserved joy that still felt like the purest thing I could remember. 18 months ago, Karen had kissed me in the kitchen while the kids were in bed and told me she was happy. Or I had believed she told me she was happy. I was no longer certain what I had actually heard versus what I had completed from context. The nature of the relationship between Karen and Brett remained, Gary told me, unclear from the available evidence. There were meetings, confirmed, documented, several at a restaurant in Powell, twice at Diane's house, once at a coffee shop I recognized as being 3 blocks from Karen's school. There was consistent communication. But the messages Gary could access, those on public platforms, those captured indirectly, were careful in a way that suggested Karen was aware of the possibility of scrutiny. Or she was simply a private person. I could not rule that out. Is she involved with him? I asked Gary directly. My professional opinion, he said, is yes. But I can't give you proof that would hold up in court. And I'm not sure you want that kind of proof, given what your lawyer told you about how courts view investigations. He was right. I knew he was right. What I had instead was 18 months of contact, a man who'd been in my house and learned my daughter's name, an encrypted messaging app, and a wife who slept with her phone face down. And I had Sophie's notebook. I discovered the notebook by accident, the same weekend Gary gave me his report. I was helping Sophie reorganize her bookshelf, a thing she asked me to do periodically because she wanted it arranged by a taxonomy that evolved and required external consultation, and the notebook fell from between 2 books. It was not her reading response notebook or her gem catalog. It was a small marbled composition book that I had never seen. I handed it back to her without opening it. But as I handed it back, I saw, on the exposed page, a list of names written in Sophie's careful print. At the top, people who were here. Below, Diane. Mr. Calloway. The lady from next door. Uncle Brett, same as Mr. Calloway, Mom said. Beside each name, a date. Sophie had been keeping records. My 9-year-old daughter, with the quiet instinct of someone who understood that something in her house was worth tracking, had been maintaining a guest log. I didn't say anything to her about it. I finished reorganizing the bookshelf and helped her establish the new taxonomy and read with her for 40 minutes before bed and turned off her lamp and stood in the doorway of her room for a moment looking at her in the dark. I thought, whatever else this costs me, I will not make her a casualty of it. Thomas's decision to hire a private investigator is the most morally complex choice in the narrative, and he knows it even as he makes it. The mistake is not the investigation itself, but the motivation behind it. He frames it as self-protection, as gathering context. But beneath that framing is something raw, the need to know, to have the uncertainty resolved, to trade ambiguity for confirmed pain. This is a recognizable psychological pattern in betrayal situations. Sufferers often prefer certain suffering to uncertain suffering, because certainty, however devastating, restores a sense of agency. The lesson embedded in Gary Fenwick's warning, that courts do not reward investigative fathers, is one Thomas understands intellectually but cannot fully act on. His rational mind and his wounded self are operating in parallel, and his wounded self keeps moving forward despite the rational objections. This split is not weakness. It is the ordinary human condition under extreme stress. But it carries consequences. The most unexpected element of this section is Sophie's notebook. A child maintaining a list of household visitors, annotating names and dates, demonstrates something quietly heartbreaking. The children have perceived, at their own level of understanding, that something in the household requires monitoring. Sophie does not know what she's tracking or why. She is simply doing what she does, observing, recording, trying to impose order on a situation that has become confusing. That a 9-year-old has arrived independently at the same coping mechanism as her father. Careful documentation in the face of uncertainty speaks to both the inherited trait and the shared environment of a family quietly fracturing. Thomas's decision not to open the notebook, to hand it back without reading it, is significant. It represents the one moment in this section where his instinct for protection overrides his need to know. He has a line, and the line is his daughter's privacy. That he holds it, even now, tells us something essential about who he is as a father, and it will matter. The custody hearing was scheduled for the second week of February. In the weeks between December and February, Karen and I maintained a careful, exhausting diplomacy, the kind practiced by two people who understand that their children are listening through every wall. We established a temporary informal arrangement. Karen had the children 4 days. I had them 3, the switch happening on Wednesday evening and Sunday morning with the children's backpacks, and Owen's current dinosaur and Sophie's notebook moved between cars with the precision of a prisoner exchange. The children adapted with the particular resilience of children who are told that everything is fine and choose, provisionally, to believe it. Owen was confused and expressed it in the oblique way of 6-year-olds. He became temporarily convinced that dinosaurs had gone extinct because they had made their parents sad. A connection I found both absurd and unbearable. Sophie expressed nothing directly for 2 weeks, and then one evening, while I was making dinner at my apartment, a rented 2-bedroom on Morse Road with carpeting the color of old toast, she sat at the kitchen counter and said, "Dad, are you and Mom going to fight about us?" I turned from the stove. "We're going to talk about what's best for you," I said. "That's not what I asked." 9 years old. The precision of it. "We disagree about some things," I said. "That's honest." She processed this. "I want to stay with you on Tuesdays," she said. "Owen has swim on Tuesdays, and he always needs someone to count his laps." "I'll be there on Tuesdays," I said. "Okay," she said, and went back to the book she'd been reading. The confrontation, the real one, the one I had been building toward for months, did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in a parking lot. It was a Wednesday in January, the evening handoff. I had pulled up to Karen's house. Our house, still technically, though I'd stopped thinking of it that way, and I was walking up the driveway when I saw the car. A dark blue Audi SUV parked at the curb in front of the house, the engine running, parking lights on. A man in the driver's seat that I recognized from Gary's photographs. Brett Calloway. Waiting. I stood on the driveway for 5 seconds that felt like structural failure in slow motion, the kind where you watch each element give way in sequence and understand that the collapse is complete before the last thing falls. Then I walked to the car. He saw me coming. To his credit, and I have thought about this credit, how I resent offering it, he did not drive away. He rolled down the window. He was as Sophie had described. Tall, brown hair going gray, calm in a way that suggested he had prepared for this. "You're Thomas," he said. "You're in front of my house," I said. My voice was very quiet. This was not calm. It was compression, the way a structure under extreme load becomes quieter as the stress concentrates rather than disperses. "I know," he said. "I was going to leave before. My children are inside that house," I said. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, exactly, but the specific discomfort of someone confronting a consequence they'd allowed themselves to theorize about without fully inhabiting. "I know," he said again. "Do you know that my daughter keeps a record of every time you've been in her house?" I asked. "That she wrote your name in a notebook because she noticed something worth writing down?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't know about the notebook." "She's 9, I said. "She shouldn't have to keep records." Another silence. The engine ran between us. "I'm not going to make a speech at you," I said. "I just want you to understand that whatever's happening, the children are real. They're not a detail to be managed. They're people who are going to remember this." He nodded. "I understand. I don't think you do," I said. "But I hope you will." I walked back up the driveway. I picked up Owen and Sophie, loaded their backpacks, counted Owen's dinosaur collection 3 times because he insisted a stegosaurus had been left inside, found the stegosaurus, and drove to my apartment on Morse Road with its old toast carpeting and made pasta for dinner and helped with homework and put them both to bed. I did not tell Karen what had happened in the parking lot. Not that night. I told her the next morning, on the phone, with the flat delivery of someone reading from a report. I told her what I'd seen, what I'd said, what he'd said. I told her I wasn't calling to fight. I was calling because she needed to know that I knew, and that the hearing was in 3 weeks, and that I intended to be present for my children regardless of what the court decided, and that I was not going to be managed into the margins of their lives. The silence on her end lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "I didn't plan for you to be hurt like this." "I know," I said. "That doesn't make it better," she said. "No," I said. "It doesn't." Another silence. Then, "He's not going to be around the children." "Not until," she stopped. "Not until things are settled." "Thank you," I said, and meant it. We did not speak again before the hearing except through our lawyers. The hearing itself was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was a morning in a wood-paneled courtroom with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look vaguely unwell, a judge who had seen 10,000 variations of this particular sorrow, and 2 attorneys making arguments about the nature of presence and the definition of primary care. Karen's attorney argued that she had been the primary caregiver, factually true in the specific sense that she had been physically present more hours than I had, due to my travel. She used the word absence 9 times in her opening remarks, which I counted. Patricia countered with documentation, pediatric appointment records, school event calendars, emails from teachers addressing both parents, a log of the past 4 months, the swim lessons, the museum visits, the homework sessions, the Tuesday lab counting, maintained with the disciplined thoroughness of an engineer who had been told to document and had documented everything. And then Sophie's teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, gave a brief statement she had offered voluntarily. Patricia had not requested it, which made it land differently. She said that Thomas Mercer attended conferences, responded to communications, and that when Sophie had gone through a period of anxiety in the fall, it was her father who had called to ask what the school could do. The fall, when I had not yet known what I was dealing with, when I had been covering Owen with a blanket and reading text messages I wasn't supposed to read. I had called Sophie's teacher in October and sat on the phone in my car for 20 minutes talking about what Sophie might need. I had not remembered this as a significant thing. It had simply been a thing a parent does. The judge looked at the file for a long time. Then she looked at Karen, and then at me, with the evaluating gaze of someone who has learned to see through both the arguments people make and the arguments they don't know they're making. "Joint physical custody," she said, "with a schedule to be determined in mediation. The court finds no evidence that either parent presents a risk to the children, and considerable evidence that both parents are actively engaged." Karen's attorney had been angling for a 70-30 split in Karen's favor. What we got was roughly equal. I sat in the hard chair in that courtroom and felt something I did not expect. Not triumph, not relief, not vindication. I felt something quieter and stranger, the sensation of a structure holding under a load it wasn't designed for, sustaining itself against the probability of failure. It would have to be enough. The parking lot confrontation is the emotional climax of the narrative, but Thomas's choice of how to conduct it reveals something fundamental about his character. He does not shout, does not threaten, does not make the encounter about his own injury. Instead, he makes it about Sophie's notebook, about the fact that a 9-year-old has been keeping records because she sensed something that required tracking. In channeling his anger through the lens of his daughter's experience, Thomas transforms a personal confrontation into a moral one, and this shift is both genuine and tactically sound. Brett Calloway's response, quiet, prepared, without deflection, suggests a man who is not a villain, but who has allowed himself the comfortable fiction that the people he was displacing were abstractions. Thomas's statement, "They're not a detail to be managed, they're people who will remember this," punctures that fiction. The confrontation achieves what most confrontations in these situations fail to achieve. It delivers truth without escalation, and it is heard. Thomas's decision to call Karen the following morning rather than weaponizing the encounter is equally significant. He does not use the knowledge of Brett's presence as leverage in the hearing. He simply tells Karen what happened and states his position. He will not be managed into the margins. This is not restraint for its own sake. It is the decision of a man who understands that the conflict most worth winning is the one about his children's daily lives, not the one about his ex-wife's choices. The hearing itself demonstrates a principle that runs throughout the story, that documented love has a different weight than asserted love. Thomas has always been present, but presence is invisible until it's recorded. Mrs. Alvarez's voluntary testimony. The phone call about Sophie's anxiety that Thomas had not even flagged as significant is the most powerful moment in the courtroom precisely because it was not strategic. It was simply true, and truth that emerges without being engineered tends to carry the most authority. Spring came to Columbus the way it always does, with a week of false warmth followed by 2 more weeks of cold that felt like a personal rebuke, and then suddenly, without announcement, the temperature held and the trees committed. The mediation took 6 sessions and produced a schedule. Karen had the children Sunday evening through Wednesday morning. I had Wednesday evening through Sunday morning. This meant, among other things, that I had them every weekend, an arrangement I'd requested and Karen had accepted, I think, because she understood that my weekends had always been the time I was most present, and because she was, underneath everything, a fair person. I moved out of the apartment on Morse Road and into a house 3 miles from the school. This was deliberate. Everything was deliberate now. Every decision made with the awareness that the children needed to feel that both their lives were real, that neither parent was a visitor. The house was a 1950s ranch that needed work. I put Sophie's room on the south side for the morning light. I let Owen choose the color of his room, which turned out to be orange in a shade that was aggressive enough to be impressive. On the first night the children slept in the new house, Owen stood in the doorway of his orange room for a long time before bed, looking at it. Then he said, "It's like being inside a dinosaur's stomach." "Is that good?" I asked. He considered this seriously. "Probably yes," he said. Sophie, who had been quiet during the move, asked me that same night to help her start a new notebook. Not a record-keeping notebook, just a notebook for things she wanted to remember. She wanted a blue one. I drove to a drugstore at 9 p.m. and bought her a blue marble composition book, and she wrote something in it immediately, and I did not ask what, and she did not tell me. I began therapy in March, not because I was required to, not because anyone had suggested it, but because I had spent months operating at a stress load that exceeded design capacity, and I understood that structures require maintenance. My therapist was a man named Dr. Harmon, who had the specific patience of someone who has learned that the things people lead with are rarely what they actually need to say. We talked, over many weeks, about anger I hadn't named, about the particular grief of a marriage that had not been terrible, that had simply been insufficient, in ways that required 2 people to acknowledge but that only one of them had been tracking. "The hardest thing," I told him once, "is that I can't make her the villain. I've tried. It would be easier." "Why would it be easier?" he asked. "Because then I'd know what I was mourning," I said. But she was a good mother. She baked on Sundays. She remembered every school thing. She just stopped being there for me. And I missed it for so long that by the time I noticed, I was already someone she was leaving. Dr. Harmon looked at me for a moment. "And what about you?" he said. "Were you there for her?" I sat with that question for the rest of the session. I brought it home. I sat with it on the porch of my new house in the long spring evenings while Owen excavated something in the yard and Sophie read in the window seat. I'd built her on a Saturday in April. I turned the question over and examined it the way I examined structures, looking for where the load had been distributed, where the gaps were, what had been left unbraced. The honest answer was complicated. I had been present in every way I understood presence to mean. I had not been present in some ways I had not known mattered until they had mattered past recovery. We had both, I think, been speaking a language the other couldn't quite hear, and neither of us had asked for a translator until too late. Karen and I did not become friends. That is not a real thing, I think. The kind of friendship depicted in magazine articles about conscious uncoupling, former spouses who barbecue together and laugh about old times. What we became was something more useful and less comfortable. 2 people who shared the most important project either of us had ever worked on, who communicated with the careful precision of professionals who needed to collaborate, but had stopped trusting each other as intimates. We got better at it over time. We had to. Diane called me in April. She opened with, "I heard it went reasonably well." "Reasonably," I said. "I'm sorry," she said. "For all of it. I should have said something sooner." "You said something," I told her. "It mattered." A pause. "Are you angry at me?" I thought about it. I said. "I'm tired of being angry. It uses up space I need for other things." She laughed a little, the first real Diane laugh I'd heard in months, the loud percussive one that had always made Karen roll her eyes with affection. That's a very Thomas thing to say, she said. It probably was. The summer came, and with it the new rhythm of our lives. 2 houses, 2 sets of routines, the constant small logistics of a family that has been redistributed rather than ended. I learned to send Owen with his stegosaurus in a small zippered pouch I kept in his bag specifically so it wouldn't be left behind. Sophie developed the habit of texting me, a 9-year-old who texted brief, declarative reports, made pasta, used your recipe, better than mom's. Don't tell her. I replied, never. Send photo. She sent a photo. The pasta looked excellent. In August, just before the school year started, Owen climbed into my lap while I was on the porch and asked me, with the directness unique to 6-year-olds, Dad, are you sad? I thought about saying no. I thought about the various adult strategies for deflecting this kind of question into something manageable. Then I thought about Sophie asking me, in February, whether Karen and I were going to fight about them, and how I'd told her the honest thing rather than the comfortable thing. In August, just before the school year started, Owen climbed into my lap while I was on the porch and asked me, with the directness unique to 6-year-olds, Dad, are you sad? I thought about saying no. I thought about the various adult strategies for deflecting this kind of question into something manageable. Then I thought about Sophie asking me, in February, whether Karen and I were going to fight about them, and how I'd told her the honest thing rather than the comfortable thing. Sometimes, I said. He absorbed this. Me too, he said. Sometimes. What helps? I asked. He thought for a long time, with the seriousness he brought to weight calculations. Dinosaurs, he said. And when you count my laps. I'm always going to count your laps, I said. Even when I'm big. Even when you're enormous, I said. He seemed satisfied with this. He stayed in my lap for a while longer, watching something in the yard that only he could see, and I held the weight of him and the specific warmth of a summer evening, and I thought, this is what survives. Not the marriage, not the version of the future I had built in my mind and occupied for 9 years. But this, a child's weight, a counted lap, a blue notebook, a room the color of a dinosaur stomach. This is what holds. What this story ultimately demonstrates is not a single dramatic betrayal, but the slow accumulation of unaddressed distance, and the way that distance, left unexamined long enough, becomes structural. The marriage between Thomas and Karen did not collapse from one catastrophic failure, but from the incremental settling of 2 people whose forms of love, whose languages of need, had never been made fully legible to each other. Thomas's form of love was labor and attention, the twice-painted purple room, the dinosaur birthday cake, the phone call to Sophie's teacher. These are real expressions of care, and they are real contributions to family life. But they do not, by themselves, constitute emotional intimacy. Karen's growing disconnection suggests a different hunger for something Thomas had not provided, whether because he didn't know how, didn't know it was missing, or because the habits of a long marriage had made the asking feel unnecessary. Neither of these failures is unique or unforgivable. They are the ordinary failures of 2 people who loved each other adequately for a long time and then found that adequate was not enough. What makes the story painful is precisely its ordinariness, the absence of a clear villain, the absence of a single fixable mistake. The custody battle, which might have been a war, became instead a negotiation, difficult, costly, but ultimately oriented toward the children's welfare rather than parental pride. Thomas's consistent choice to prioritize Sophie and Owen over his own injury, not to open the notebook, not to weaponize the parking lot encounter, not to use Brett's presence as leverage, is what enables this. His willingness to hear Dr. Harmon's question, "Were you there for her?" and sit with it honestly rather than defensively, is what enables the next part of his life to be different. The final image, Owen in Thomas's lap, summer evening, the weight of a child who is sometimes sad and sometimes satisfied with dinosaurs and counted laps, is not resolution in the sense of answers. It is resolution in the structural sense, a load-bearing element that holds. Thomas has lost the marriage, the shared house, the version of fatherhood he imagined. What he retains is the most essential thing, the thing that was never contingent on the marriage, the daily, ordinary, irreplaceable presence of a father who shows up and counts the laps. The story's ultimate lesson is not about betrayal or survival, but about the difference between the love we perform and the love we practice. And the long, costly process of learning which one we've actually been offering. Statistics show that in contested custody cases in the United States, fathers who actively document their caregiving involvement are significantly more likely to receive joint physical custody. Yet fewer than 30% of non-residential fathers maintain any formal record of their parental engagement. The most powerful evidence in family court is often the most ordinary. A Tuesday at the pool, a phone call to a teacher, a notebook kept for the right reasons.